He married 3 close relatives, his cousin, his niece, and his cousin aunt. His only son went mad. His wives died young, and his children, born from incestuous unions, perished one by one. Behind his vast empire stood coffins, each carved by his own bloodline. This is the tragic price of royal inbreeding. The blood that made him king was the same blood that haunted his family for centuries. Philip II of Spain was born in 1527. The firstborn son of Emperor Charles V and Isabella of Portugal. But their love, if it ever existed, was never the point. They were first cousins, joined not by passion, but by dynastic calculation, political fear, and the sacred obsession of the Habsburg dynasty, to keep power pure, even if the blood became poisoned. He was not born to a cradle, but to a bloodline coiled like a serpent around itself. The Habsburgs did not marry strangers. They married reflections, cousins, nieces, uncles. The family tree was less a tree than a spiral, folding in tighter and tighter with each generation, until it no longer reached toward heaven, but burrowed inward, twisting into silence, deformity, and madness. Philip's own body bore the signature of this legacy. He inherited the Habsburg jaw, pronounced angular, unsettling, a chin so prominent that it interfered with speech, with eating, with the illusion of normalcy. Court painters flattered him, softened the lines, shaded the angles. But no artist could erase what God and blood had written into his bones. His eyes were solemn even as a child, his hands delicate and pale, never accustomed to labor or embrace. He was a boy of titles, prayers, and portraits, surrounded from infancy by the dead. The royal palace in Valladolid was not a place for children to laugh. It was a cathedral of duty. Every hallway whispered of empires. Every room reeked of incense, candle wax, and the slow decay of centuries. Paintings of ancestors stared down from gilded frames. Kings, queens, consorts, martyrs, most of them married to their cousins, most of them dead before their time. Philip played not with toys, but with maps. From the age of 5, he studied Latin, canon law, royal protocol. Tutors corrected the way he stood, the way he bowed, the angle of his signature. His movements were choreographed. His voice was measured. Even his silences were rehearsed. He was not a boy being raised. He was a king being forged. His father, Charles V, rarely smiled. He ruled not only Spain, but the Holy Roman Empire, a vast, fragmented realm soaked in both Catholic faith and Protestant rebellion. Charles spent more time in military camps than in nurseries. He saw in his son not a child, but a successor, a vessel, a name. Philip learned early that love was not currency at court. Only blood mattered. Not warm blood, but pure blood. Blood proven, traced, calculated across parchments and generations. Blood that must never be diluted, even if it meant marrying someone who shared your mother's face or your grandfather's disease. His mother, Isabella of Portugal, was one of the few people who gave him gentleness. But she too was shaped by duty. When she died in 1539, Philip was only 12. Her death was not just a personal loss. It was a moment of inheritance. The boy became the man of the court, and the court was a machine that had no place for mourning. After Isabella's death, Charles V withdrew further into the business of empire. Philip was handed over to statesmen, bishops, and protocol officers. Grief was absorbed into routine. Mourning clothes were worn not for healing, but for symbolism. The kingdom could not wait. The future king had to be ready. By 15, Philip was already being discussed as a marriage pawn, one to be used, traded, and sacrificed as the empire required. There were whispers of princesses in France, daughters in Portugal, widows in England. Every potential bride was also a relative. Every proposal began with a genealogical chart. There was no question of marrying outside the family. That would be betrayal. Philip was molded in this logic until he could no longer see outside it. The world was a chessboard. Women were alliances. Children were vessels. Emotions were distractions. God was the architect of all things, including incest if it preserved the empire. And yet, beneath this machinery, there was something soft, something flickering. Some fragment of a boy who looked at the portraits of his ancestors and wondered not how they ruled, but how they died. Because so many had died. Infant mortality was common in royal lines, but the Habsburgs were exceptional. Children born with misshapen heads, limbs that trembled, minds that unraveled by adolescence. There were rumors whispered in the halls of monasteries, behind tapestries, in the diaries of foreign ambassadors. The blood is too thick. The line is cursed. Even the angels avert their eyes. And yet no one stopped the spiral. They couldn't. To marry outside the bloodline was to risk politics, alliances, legitimacy. Better a dead child than a foreign heir. Better a mad prince than a broken empire. This was the price they were willing to pay, and the price Philip II inherited before he could even understand it. So he grew. He grew tall, solemn, quiet. He prayed often. He confessed constantly. He distrusted laughter. He believed in sin more than in joy. His favorite pastimes were reading religious texts, commissioning architecture, and writing edicts in his own hand. Even as a teenager, he seemed old. There are few records of Philip expressing affection, fewer still of him smiling. He was respected, feared, obeyed, but never truly loved by the people around him. They admired his discipline, his piety, his intelligence. But even his own courtiers called him cold. Some said he was born without warmth. Others said the palace drained it from him. But the truth was simpler. He was the product of centuries of calculation, of marriages made in candlelit chapels, of vows whispered between cousins, of generations that chose lineage over health, purity over happiness. He was the heir of kings, the seed of a curse, and he would carry that curse forward into every bedchamber, every wedding ceremony, every birth, and every burial that followed. Because he believed it was God's will, because he had no other choice. At 16, Philip wore the robes of a king, but carried the gaze of a boy who had been trained to bury his feelings under velvet and protocol. He was still in mourning for his mother, still absorbing the cold lessons of a court that worshipped bloodlines more than mercy. And it was in this atmosphere of calculation and holy inheritance that the plan for his first marriage was laid, not in whispers of romance or glimpses of affection, but in silence, ink, and blood. The bride selected for him was Maria Manuela of Portugal, the daughter of King John III and Catherine of Austria. She was not just a cousin, she was a double first cousin. Her mother was Philip's paternal aunt. Her father was his maternal uncle. Their bloodlines curved in on each other like vines choking the same root. It was, by all royal standards of the time, a perfect match. Politically sound, religiously righteous, genetically catastrophic. The union would strengthen ties between the Iberian thrones. It would reinforce Habsburg supremacy on the peninsula. It would keep the line unbroken. It would also, inevitably, deepen the spiral. Maria was 15 when she was sent from Portugal to Castile, her journey slow and ceremonial, marked by bells and banners, every mile a reminder that she was not a girl, but an offering. her body a bridge between monarchies, her womb a vessel for succession. Philip greeted her with composure, the kind expected of a young sovereign. He bowed. He thanked her. He smiled briefly. What passed between them in private, if anything passed at all, was never written, never preserved, never even rumored, because it didn't matter. Affection was not a condition of royal marriage, nor was compatibility, nor was youth. All that mattered was that she bore the right name, the right crest, the right blood. They were married in Salamanca, 1543, in a ceremony grander than most coronations, attended by nobles from both kingdoms, cloaked clergy, golden relics, and enough incense to choke the rafters. It was a spectacle not of joy, but of order. A declaration that the empire was intact, that its heirs would be legitimate, and that Philip was ready to fulfill the role carved for him by generations of calculated unions. And yet, for a moment, just a moment, there was the illusion of something softer. Philip is said to have looked at Maria with tenderness, not passion, not desire, but something like calm. She was intelligent, quiet, fluent in the languages of court and prayer. She admired art as he did. She followed rules as he did. She did not weep in public or speak out of turn. They walked the gardens of Aranjuez together. They exchanged verses of religious poetry. They dined in silence together. It was enough, or it might have been. A year later, Maria became pregnant. The court rejoiced. Bells rang. Masses were held across Spain. The child in her womb was no longer just a promise. It was a triumph of lineage, the proof that God had not yet cursed the Habsburgs. But the pregnancy was difficult. Maria was weak, pale, often feverish. Midwives whispered of signs, of bad omens. Her belly grew, but her strength diminished. Some said the child moved too much. Others said not at all. Philip, for the first time in his young reign, showed signs of fear. He prayed more often. He visited her chambers. He tightened security around the palace and ordered fresh physicians from Portugal. But none could ease the delivery. In July 1545, Maria gave birth to a boy, Don Carlos. But in the same room, in the same bed, beneath the same crucifix that had blessed the union, she died. She was 17. Her body was buried in the El Escorial crypt that Philip would one day design with unbearable precision. Her death was swift, clinical, and final. Her memory would not be. Philip did not cry in public. He did not cancel state affairs. He did not collapse beneath the weight of grief like a lover from poetry. But he wore black for months, for years, not just for tradition, but as a second skin. He retreated from music. He banned certain entertainments at court. He began to commission darker tapestries, more austere chapels. He had mass said for her daily, and he visited her tomb long after others forgot she had existed. Maria had not been his equal, not his partner, not even truly his wife in any emotional sense. But she had been the first to lie beside him, the first to die in his name, the first to turn the promise of dynasty into the echo of loss. And Don Carlos, the child she left behind, was not the miracle the court had hoped for. The boy's skull was slightly misshapen, his body thin, his eyes restless. Doctors muttered but dared not say the word: defect. The wet nurses complained of erratic crying. His tutors struggled to reach him. His servants noticed strange behaviors, long silences, sudden bursts of rage, an unwillingness to eat. Still, he was the heir. Philip looked at him not with warmth, but with responsibility. And something else, something no historian can quite describe. Perhaps dread, perhaps denial, perhaps the first shadow of guilt. But at this moment, this single moment, Philip was both a widower and a father. His kingdom expected him to move forward. He had fulfilled his duty, married a cousin, sired a son, preserved the line. Now, the court said, he must do it again. There would be mourning, yes, but only within the limits of decorum. There would be grief, but only behind locked doors. Because the bloodline was not yet secure. Because one child, one fragile boy born of coiled blood, was not enough. Because kings were not allowed to stop. Because love could be buried, but the empire must endure. England was never his home. Its skies were too gray, its winds too biting, its people too proud and far too Protestant. But for Philip II of Spain, the marriage to Mary Tudor was never meant to be about comfort. It was about conquest, a union inked in strategy, sanctified in ceremony, and carried out beneath a sky heavy with suspicion. She was 10 years older than him, a queen in her own right, a woman desperate for legitimacy, an heir, and, perhaps most of all, someone who would not abandon her like everyone else had. Mary had waited years to rule, suffering the indignities of being labeled illegitimate by her own father, Henry VIII, and watching her mother cast aside like refuse. When she finally took the throne in 1553, she did so not with triumph, but with trembling hands. England was Protestant. She was not. England was volatile. She was devout. And in the face of this instability, her advisors whispered what monarchs always heard in times of doubt. You must marry. And so she turned to Spain, more precisely to her cousin, Philip, son of Charles V, her Habsburg blood relative and the most powerful Catholic prince in Europe. The match made sense on paper. Philip would reinforce England's return to Catholicism. He would serve as Mary's political equal. He would bring with him the promise of imperial partnership. But what looked noble on parchment became treacherous in the hearts of the English people. They hated him before he even arrived. They called him a foreign invader, a parasite, a Spanish serpent with papal fangs. Pamphlets circulated in secret, depicting him as a tyrant in waiting, a king who would enslave the island and hand its crown to the Pope. Parliament demanded conditions. Philip would never be king in name. He would hold no English power. He would inherit nothing should Mary die. He would be, in title, a prince, but in reality, a guest. Philip accepted. He had no choice. In 1554, he crossed the Channel with a retinue of Spanish nobles and soldiers. He stepped onto English soil to a reception both grand and cold. Bells rang, streets were cleared, and yet the faces watching from windows were tight-lipped, silent, unwelcoming. He met Mary in Winchester Cathedral. She wore a gown of gold. He wore armor inlaid with silver. They looked regal, holy, united. But even the clergy sensed the dissonance. There was no warmth between them, no softness, no tremble of affection in the vows. Only the precision of duty. She loved him, or tried to. She sent him letters, written with a yearning that felt almost childish. She referred to him as her dearest lord, begged for his attention, prayed for his presence. She longed to be a wife in truth, not just in title. To give him an heir, to be enough for him. But she wasn't. Philip tolerated her. He fulfilled the role expected of him, appeared beside her at Mass, attended state councils, spoke with courtesy, dined with formality. but his heart remained elsewhere. Buried in the cold sanctuaries of Spain, wrapped in the memory of Maria Manuela, and knotted in worry over the increasingly erratic behavior of his son, Don Carlos. He stayed in England for 13 months. 13 months of cold dinners, political tension, and false hope. Because Mary thought she was pregnant, twice. Her belly swelled, her breasts ached. Her servants prepared birthing chambers. Midwives were summoned, and England held its breath. But nothing came. No cries, no child, no heir, just silence and shame. It was not a miscarriage. It was not stillbirth. It was nothing at all. A phantom pregnancy, brought on perhaps by age, by desperation, or by the cruelest hand of divine mockery. The court blamed stress. Physicians whispered about tumors. Mary wept in private. Philip, meanwhile, had already left. He returned to Brussels, then to Spain. He cited matters of state. He promised to return soon, but he never did. Not with conviction, not with urgency. His letters to her became shorter, less frequent, and increasingly formal. Mary, however, clung to the illusion. She believed he would come back. She believed she could conceive again. She believed God had tested her, not forsaken her. And so she continued to send him prayers, tokens, reminders of a love that had never truly existed. In 1558, she fell ill. The fever lasted weeks. She lost her appetite. Her skin turned pale, then gray. She could no longer walk. In her final days, she was surrounded not by warmth, but by silence. Courtiers unsure whether to grieve or prepare for a new reign. She asked for Philip. He did not come. He sent a letter. He arranged a mass. And with that, their marriage ended, quietly, coldly, like a candle extinguished not by wind, but by lack of air. Mary Tudor died childless, alone. She was remembered by history as Bloody Mary, a name given not for her marriage, but for her persecution of Protestants. But Philip would remember her, if at all, as a failed alliance. No heir, no lasting gain, no affection that mattered. He had gambled on England and left with nothing, except perhaps a deeper sense of isolation. Because this marriage, his second, had not just failed to produce a child. It had confirmed something darker, that perhaps the throne itself was cursed, that love would never find a home in his life, that every woman he touched would become another entry in the long litany of funerals. And yet, even in that failure, Philip did not falter. He did what the Habsburgs had always done. He looked for the next bride. He studied genealogies. He examined charts. He consulted with Rome, because the empire still needed an heir, because Don Carlos was growing more unstable by the day, because even failure must serve the crown. And so, once again, the papers were drawn, the bloodlines traced, the matches considered, and the wheel turned again. Not toward love, but toward another niece, another name, another womb, another funeral waiting in the distance. She was 14, he was 44. And yet, in the eyes of God, and more importantly, in the eyes of the Habsburg court, Anna of Austria was not a child, not a niece, not a Satya, not a girl who still believed in lace and lullabies. She was a bride, a vessel, a chance to repair what had been broken. The alliance was perfect on paper. Anna was the daughter of Maria of Spain, Philip's own sister, and Maximilian II, Holy Roman Emperor. That made her not just his niece, but a double reassurance. Habsburg on both sides, royal on both fronts, unblemished by foreign blood. And after the failed English gamble, Philip needed reassurance. He needed a wife whose loyalty came not from treaty, but from genealogy. No one would question this union. No one dared. Not the church, which sanctioned it. Not the court, which applauded it. Not Anna, who was raised from birth to marry an uncle. She was pale, quiet, devout. Her letters were brief, her smile restrained, her German accent softened by Spanish tutors. She had been raised to obey. And in a dynasty where women were traded like relics, obedience was the only dowry that mattered. The wedding took place in Segovia, 1570. Gold, incense, and roses. A celebration without laughter. A ceremony heavy with silence. Anna did not tremble. She bowed her head and folded her hands, the picture of solemnity. She walked beside Philip like a girl stepping into shadow. No protest, no hesitation, only duty. And yet, something strange happened. He softened. Philip, the man whose heart had grown calloused by statecraft, by loss, by the weight of coffins and treaties, seemed, briefly, at ease. Around Anna, his voice grew quieter, not colder. He spent time in her company, not out of obligation, but inclination. He listened to her thoughts, however softly spoken. He walked with her in the gardens, slower than before, less as a monarch, more as a man who had forgotten how to breathe. She made him laugh. Not often, but once was enough. Anna's presence brought something rare to court. Calm. The courtiers noticed. The ministers whispered. The priests thanked God. And then the children began to arrive. First, Ferdinand, born strong, healthy, watched over like a saint in swaddling. He cooed, kicked, clutched Philip's finger. For a moment, the king believed. For a moment, the line was safe. Then Ferdinand died. Just a few months old, no illness, no warning. Just silence one morning and a cradle filled with stillness. Then came Carlos Lorenzo. He survived longer, 7 years. A bright boy, intelligent, curious, eager to please. He held the hopes of a court desperate for redemption. He died of fever in the middle of a damp winter. Then Diego. Then another Ferdinand. Then Maria. Each child came into the world with banners and bells. Each left it with candles and weeping. Anna's womb bore life, but the blood inside it betrayed her. 4 children dead, 1 remaining, Philip III, the quietest of them all. Frail, gentle, easily led, but he lived. And that, in the court's eyes, was enough. Philip did not cry at the funerals. He stood still, hands clasped, lips moving in prayer. But his eyes lost something with each burial. Not just light, but belief. As if even his faith, so absolute, so consuming, had begun to flicker. Anna changed too. She aged faster than time allowed. Her face grew hollow, her voice fainter. Each pregnancy drained her, each loss left her paler, quieter, more shadow than person. Yet she never complained. She knelt beside her husband in chapel. She sat beside him at meals. She comforted him when he raged against illness, when he buried his face in his hands after another child was taken. She had been his niece. She became his wife. But in the end, she was his last companion. In 1580, pregnant again, she fell ill. The child, another daughter, was born alive but weak. Anna, however, did not survive the labor. Her body, exhausted by grief, by childbirth, by the long years of playing consort and ghost, could not recover. Philip stood beside her deathbed, silent. It is said he did not speak for 3 days. He wore black from that moment on, not just as mourning, but as identity. The court tried to suggest new matches. Diplomats sent names, proposals, portraits. He refused them all. He never remarried. Because something in him had finally broken. Not politically, not publicly, but deeply, quietly, in the space no crown could reach. Anna had been different, not because of who she was, but because of what she had endured. She had walked beside him, not just as a relative, not merely as a queen, but as a soul who understood the cost of inheritance. He did not commission great monuments in her name. He did not speak endlessly of her virtues, but he kept a miniature of her in his study. He kissed it when no one watched. He carried it with him when his body began to decay. And with her death, the palace grew colder. No music, no laughter, no children running down corridors, only echoes, only prayers, only the rustle of pages and the footsteps of widowers. Philip ruled an empire, but his home was a tomb, and the last door of that tomb had just closed. He was born under the weight of 2 crowns and 1,000 doubts. Don Carlos of Austria entered the world in 1545, the long-awaited son of Philip II and his double first cousin, Maria Manuela of Portugal. His birth was hailed as a victory. Bells rang across Castile. Foreign ambassadors offered congratulations. Priests declared it a sign of divine favor. But the blood that made him royal had also made him fragile. From the beginning, something was wrong. The infant's head was misshapen, elongated at the back and narrow in the front. His jaw, like his father's, was too large for his mouth. He had difficulty feeding. He cried uncontrollably. His limbs spasmed without warning. And when he slept, his body jerked violently, as if seized by unseen forces. Still, he was alive. And that, for a Habsburg heir, was enough to celebrate. Doctors wrote careful reports. Nurses learned to manage his outbursts. Tutors were selected with extreme care. Men of patience, piety, and unwavering discretion. His education began early, but progress was erratic. Some days he recited Latin with ease. Other days he screamed at his reflection in mirrors or tore pages from books in silence. As he grew, so did the shadows. At 10, he pushed a servant down a staircase and laughed as the man's legs snapped. At 12, he locked a cat in a chest and forgot it there. At 13, he refused to eat for a week, claiming his food was poisoned. His tutors begged for leniency. His doctors whispered warnings. His mind, they said, was like a glass goblet, seemingly whole but always one touch away from shattering. Philip watched from a distance. He loved his son, not as a father might love a child, but as a king loves a future. Carlos was the continuation of the line, the seal of legitimacy, the embodiment of duty fulfilled. But love is not always enough, and when Carlos began to unravel, Philip did not react with affection, but calculation. At 15, Carlos fell down a staircase. Some say it was an accident. Others believe he was pushed or jumped. His head struck the stone. He lay unconscious for hours. When he awoke, he was changed. More volatile, more paranoid, more violent. He spoke in riddles. He threatened ministers. He beat servants with his fists. He carried knives and refused to sleep unless his room was bolted shut. The court murmured. The church worried. The empire held its breath. In 1567, Carlos became obsessed with Elizabeth of Valois, Philip's third wife, Carlos's stepmother, and perhaps, in his confused mind, a symbol of everything he had been denied. He wrote her letters. He followed her through the palace. He attempted to enter her chambers at night. Guards were posted. Doors were locked. Rumors spread like wildfire. Carlos had become dangerous, not just to himself, but to the kingdom. He began to speak openly of rebellion. He promised to escape to Flanders and join the enemies of Spain. He cursed his father in public. He claimed he would burn the palace. He drew maps, circled cities, plotted escape routes, and stored food under floorboards. Philip could no longer pretend. On January 18, 1568, he made the most terrible decision a monarch and a father could face. He ordered the arrest of his own son. Don Carlos was taken by surprise, unarmed, unguarded. A small group of trusted men entered his room. He fought. He bit one of them. He shouted threats and curses, but he was subdued, disarmed, and locked away in a set of interior rooms, windowless, soundproof, sealed with orders and prayers. The cell had no visitors. His meals were passed through a slit in the door. No books, no mirrors, no letters. Only a crucifix on the wall and the sound of his own breathing. At first, Carlos screamed. He pounded on the walls. He refused food. He tore at his hair. He sang hymns in strange rhythms. But no one answered. No one came. No one touched him. Weeks passed, then months. His body thinned. His skin bruised from self-inflicted blows. His mind decayed like fruit in a sealed jar, softening, warping, leaking into itself. On July 24, 1568, 6 months after his imprisonment, Carlos died. The official cause was listed as natural illness, but nature in this case was a smokescreen. Some said he starved himself. Others whispered of poison, perhaps mercury, perhaps opium, perhaps holy water laced with quiet death. The truth remains unknown. The silence, however, was deliberate. There was no funeral procession, no eulogy, no public acknowledgement of what had happened. His body was buried quickly, his name removed from prayers, his memory sealed in the vault of royal failure. Philip never spoke of him again, not in court, not in confession, not in his diaries. He buried his son, but not the guilt. It followed him through wars, treaties, marriages, and years of growing solitude. It followed him in the corridors of El Escorial, where every echo sounded like a child's cry. It followed him in the sound of turning keys, in the smell of damp stone, in the silence of every closed door. Because Don Carlos had not simply died. He had been erased by his father's hand, by his father's fear, by the very blood that had created him. And though Spain moved on, expanding, conquering, preaching faith to the farthest corners of the world, the core had begun to rot. The bloodline was cracking. The crown was heavier than ever, and the next child, the next heir, would grow in the shadow of that locked room. After Anna died, something in Philip closed for good. He had buried his cousin wife, Maria. He had distanced himself from Mary of England. He had confined his firstborn son to a tomb of air. And now, the niece who had offered him quiet companionship, sons, and the illusion of domestic peace was gone. She died in childbirth, the most common cause of royal female death, yet each time it happened, it scraped something raw. This time, it didn't heal. Philip did not remarry. The court tried. Nobles whispered names. Portraits were sent from the Palatinate, from Tuscany, from Bavaria. But they remained rolled up, unopened, untouched. There was no more appetite for alliances, no more room in the soul for ceremony. He wore black for the rest of his life. Not just during court appearances, not just during Lent, not only for official mourning. Every day, every season, every year that followed. The black was not just color, it was conviction, an outer sign of an inner rot, the shade of ash and surrender. And from that moment, El Escorial became more than a palace. It became his world. He had built it not as a home, but as a monument. Not as a place for pleasure, but as a machine for prayer and preparation. El Escorial stood like a slab of stone against the mountains of Castile. Gray, symmetrical, austere. There were no gardens filled with laughter, no frescoes bursting with myth. Just granite walls, narrow windows, and echoing halls designed to break sound and light before they could take root. It was a palace, a monastery, and a tomb, all at once. The bones of his family were buried beneath his feet. Maria Manuela, Ana, his children. Even Don Carlos, though unspoken, rested there too, entombed in layers of incense and omission. Philip walked those corridors like a penitent monk. He no longer danced, he no longer feasted. He rarely smiled. He spent hours each day in the chapel of the Holy Sacrament, prostrate before altars, counting rosary beads worn thin by repetition. Priests nearby never dared disturb him. Servants crept like ghosts along the stone floors, their shoes softened with cloth. Even ministers spoke in halftones. The king no longer ruled through fire. He ruled through stillness. He wrote constantly, letters to bishops, to governors, to generals, to inquisitors. Pages and pages, all in his own hand. He distrusted secretaries. He corrected the grammar of nobles. He revised speeches from ambassadors word by word. He micromanaged an empire that stretched from Peru to the Philippines, from Naples to the Netherlands, from Seville to the seas beyond comprehension. But he did it alone. He trusted no one fully. Not even his surviving son. Not even God, though he feared him more than death itself. He surrounded himself not with family, but with relics. Pieces of saints, splinters from the true cross, locks of hair from virgins, a crown of thorns locked in a silver case. Dozens of sacred items, each labeled, encased, guarded like royal treasures, as if the bones of the dead could protect him from the consequences of his own life. Visitors to El Escorial found it unbearable. The air was cold, even in summer. Fires were discouraged. Laughter was considered offensive. Musicians were dismissed, jesters forbidden. Women were seen rarely, heard never. Paintings were strictly religious. Christ crucified, Mary mourning, saints burning. Even the food was ascetic. No spices, no excess, no color. Broth, bread, and boiled meat. He believed austerity pleased God. He believed discipline redeemed blood. He believed suffering was the proof of divine favor. But sometimes when no one watched, he looked toward the children's rooms, the ones that had once echoed with footsteps, with whispers, with songs, all now sealed. Curtains drawn, doors locked. And then he would go back to his writing desk and press his pen deeper into the parchment. He still governed, ruthlessly, methodically, brilliantly. He expanded the power of the Inquisition. He enforced orthodoxy across his lands. He crushed revolts in the Netherlands. He maintained colonies in the New World. He ruled over the most powerful empire Europe had ever seen. But he did so from a palace where joy had died. And his courtiers feared him, not because he shouted, not because he punished, but because he no longer needed to. A glance from Philip said more than a decree. A single raised eyebrow could cost a man his position. A refusal to speak was more terrifying than a sentence. Because the king had become unreadable, emotionless, dead behind the eyes. Those closest to him compared him to a shadow, always present, rarely tangible, colder than the walls that held him. His son, the future Philip III, grew up in this silence. He was shy, impressionable, pale. He learned quickly what not to say, He bowed often. He avoided his father's gaze, and he followed him to Mass with the quiet obedience of a child afraid to breathe too loudly. There was no laughter between them, no memories shared, no lessons passed from one generation to the next, only inheritance, only the weight of what would be his one day, a crown, a crypt, and a name. Philip had everything: power, land, wealth, victory, but he had no one left, and the palace reflected that truth better than any mirror. The king was still alive, but everything he had ever loved was dead. He believed that if he ruled himself, he could rule the world. That if he punished sin within his own soul, he could purify his empire. That if he buried his desires deep enough, disciplined his household tightly enough, built his palace with enough symmetry and sacred geometry, the chaos outside would obey. But empires are not obedient. They bleed beyond borders. They strain against maps. They grow too wide, too heavy, too distant. Even for a king who slept in a cell of stone, who governed from shadow, whose pen never ceased its trembling march across parchment, there were limits. And Philip II had reached them. The first fracture came from the north. The Netherlands, restive and proud, had long chafed under Spanish rule. They were wealthy, industrious, and stubbornly Protestant. Philip, a Catholic absolutist, saw their heresy as an insult to God and a rebellion against the divine order. He sent armies. He sent decrees. He sent the Duke of Alba with swords and gallows and burning crosses. But fire does not make loyalty. It makes smoke, and smoke drifts. For decades, the Dutch fought back, city by city, province by province. They flooded fields to stop cavalry. They hid ministers in barrels. They published pamphlets calling Philip a tyrant, a devil, a butcher cloaked in black. He called it treason. They called it freedom. The conflict dragged on for years, draining gold, blood, and morale. Victory, when it came, was always temporary. Defeat, when it arrived, felt permanent. And while Spain tried to grip the Netherlands tighter, the threads of empire began to slip elsewhere. In 1580, Philip made his boldest claim. Portugal had no clear heir. Its young king, Sebastian, had died in a crusade in Morocco, vanished without a trace, swallowed by desert and rumor. Philip, as the grandson of Manuel I of Portugal through his mother Isabella, asserted his right to the throne, and he took it, with a show of force, with titles, with processions, with popes and paperwork. For a moment, it worked. The Iberian Union was formed. Spain and Portugal were under one crown. The Atlantic trembled. The oceans opened. But empires cannot merge without friction. Portuguese nobles resented Spanish interference. Colonial administrators clashed. The spirit of Lisbon was not the silence of Madrid. And Philip, who ruled from the stillness of El Escorial, could not feel the growing tension an ocean away. Meanwhile, in the west, another enemy stirred: England. Philip had once tried to control it through marriage. That had failed. Now he sought to humble it through force. The Spanish Armada, his sacred fleet, his floating temple of Catholic vengeance, was assembled with reverence and ambition. Over 130 ships, thousands of men, barrels of holy water and gunpowder. He believed it would succeed. He needed it to succeed. But the sea is a cruel court. Storms scattered the fleet before it reached battle. English fireships burned galleons in narrow channels. Navigation faltered. Communication collapsed. And the Armada, once imagined as a dagger aimed at the Protestant heart of Europe, returned in ruins. What was left of it? Philip did not weep. He prayed. He said it was God's will. He tightened his grip on what remained. But the harder he held the empire, the more it broke in his hands. Silver shipments from the Americas began to falter. Pirate attacks increased. Inflation soared. The economy bent under the weight of endless war, endless ritual, endless death. The bureaucracy that Philip had built, every signature in his own hand, every letter reviewed, every decision centralized, could not keep pace with a world that moved faster than parchment. And his body, aging and ailing, could no longer match his ambition. He walked less. Then, not at all. He slept little. Then not at all. He dictated letters from a chair lined with linen and pain. He issued orders while his skin cracked and his legs swelled and his vision blurred. He ruled through suffering. He believed it sanctified him, that each ache was penance, that each failure was another test from God. But his people were not saints. They were starving. Rebellions flared in Aragon. Mobs attacked tax collectors. The Inquisition, once a tool of order, now festered into fear. Philip did not waver. He ordered more masses, more executions, more censors, more prayers. He believed in control, but his empire believed in escape. And beneath it all, a quiet truth rose like water beneath a floorboard. The Habsburg system, of bloodline, of obedience, of inward marriages and outward domination, was showing cracks too deep for plaster. He had no more sons. Only Philip III, weak and obedient, a pale mirror of a father who had already vanished into prayer. He had no more wives, only portraits. He had no more allies, only debts. And while the empire still bore his name, it no longer bore his weight, because the empire had outgrown the man who built it. Or perhaps the man had shrunk too far into himself to lead what he had once commanded. But Philip didn't admit defeat. He couldn't. Not to his court, not to God, not even to the dying thing he saw in the mirror each morning. He kept writing, he kept praying, he kept ruling, because that's what was left. The world may have changed outside his walls, but inside El Escorial, time stood still. He could no longer walk. The king who once paced palace corridors in silence, who once stood for hours in council chambers correcting a single word, now lay in bed, half shrouded in wool and incense, unable to move his legs without agony. His joints had swollen beyond recognition. His feet were purple, cracked and leaking fluid. His fingers, once steady on parchment, curled with pain. Gout, they called it, or God's revenge. But it was more than that. His skin split open without warning. Sores festered along his back, under his knees, inside the folds of his flesh. Fever came and went like a tide, sometimes burning, sometimes freezing, always returning. Physicians wrapped his limbs in linen and soaked with vinegar and holy oil. Priests whispered Latin prayers at his bedside, sometimes louder than the man they were meant to comfort. The chamber smelled of rot, not of death. Death was clean, but of the long, damp prelude to it. A room where flesh melted slowly, where air became thick, where no breeze dared enter. The windows were shut against the cold, against insects, against spies. The drapes were drawn. Candles lined the walls, their wax forming silent stalagmites on the tiled floor. Every few hours, a servant changed the sheets. Every few days, the mattress was burned, because no scent could be cleansed. He prayed, of course, not in sweeping proclamations, not in grand processions, but in whispers, dry, trembling, constant. A string of Ave Marias spoken through cracked lips, a chorus of Sanctus Dominus echoing through a swollen throat. He did not pray for forgiveness. He prayed for rest, not heaven, not salvation, just an end. Mass was held every hour, not daily, hourly. Even as his body collapsed, he demanded the liturgy continue, as if the repetition could hold the decay at bay, as if Latin chants could drown out the sound of his body breaking, as if the bread and wine might cleanse what medicine could not. He outlived almost everyone: his wives, his sons, his allies, his enemies. Elizabeth of Valois, buried in youth. Anna of Austria, lost to childbirth. Don Carlos, locked away and swallowed by silence. Even the commanders who had led his wars, even the confessors who had heard his sins, even the bureaucrats who had once shadowed his every breath. Gone. He had become a relic in his own palace. The courtiers who visited him did so with fear, not reverence. They knelt at the doorway, not daring to enter. They bowed without speaking. Their reports were brief, their updates cautious. No one brought news of rebellion. No one mentioned defeat. The truth was too cruel for a man whose pain had left no room for illusion. His son, Philip III, visited often, but said little. He would sit beside the bed, eyes lowered, hands folded, waiting for instruction. But there were no more lessons to give. The old king could no longer speak in paragraphs. His words came in fragments: commands, regrets, scripture. Sometimes he mistook his son for a priest. Other times, he mistook him for a memory. One day, he held the boy's hand and whispered, "Carlos?" and then fell into a fever that lasted 3 days. The monks of El Escorial walked barefoot past his door. They fasted on his behalf. They lit candles that never went out. But God did not come. Or if he did, he said nothing. Philip believed this was just, that silence was the only answer a man like him deserved, that his life, long, ordered, disciplined, had been too heavy with sin, too stained with ambition, too soaked in grief, that a clean death would be too generous. And so he lingered. His body became a thing to endure, not to possess. His breath rattled. His eyes fluttered like torn paper. His legs stiffened into angles that no longer bent. His teeth blackened. His stomach no longer accepted food. Water dripped down his throat only with effort. There were no more portraits. He had forbidden them. He did not want to be remembered like this. No brush should capture the man who had once ruled half the world, now reduced to a mound of fabric and flesh, surrounded by monks who murmured as if afraid to raise their voices above the hum of decay. And yet, his mind remained sharp. Even in his most painful hours, he asked about shipments from the Indies, about revolts in Aragon, about rumors in France. He dictated letters to generals, chastised ambassadors, corrected grammar in a treaty draft sent from Naples, because the empire still needed him. Even as he became a husk, even as his own body refused to obey the hand that once signed edicts with calm precision, even as time itself seemed to recoil from the room where he lay. He lived like this for months, longer than anyone thought possible. And each morning, when the sun failed to touch his face, when the wind failed to stir the linen curtains, when the prayers failed to end the pain, he endured. He endured because he had to, because kings do not die like men. They linger, they rot, they wait. He died without ceremony. No crowd gathered beneath the windows, no cannon fired, no nation wept aloud in public squares. The king who had once ruled the globe like a chessboard, who had signed death warrants with the same fingers that clutched rosary beads, passed into silence as if he were only a man. And perhaps by then, that was all he was. Philip II of Spain died on September 13th, 1598. He was 71. His body had long surrendered before his breath finally stopped. For weeks, he had been little more than a husk, unable to sit, to eat, to speak beyond a whisper. He was fed with spoons of broth, washed with cloths soaked in wine and vinegar, and turned by servants whose hands shook not from pity, but from fear of breaking what remained. In his final hours, his room was lit not by sun, but by candles, 40 in total, their flames flickering like souls, unsure of departure. Priests stood by his side, reading psalms in endless repetition. He clutched a crucifix worn smooth by decades of use. His lips moved, but no sound came. When his chest finally stilled, it was not a gasp, but a soft pause, as if he had simply decided to stop enduring. The royal physicians wrote a summary: natural causes, complicated by gout and ulcers. But there was nothing natural about the death of a man who had spent his entire life holding back everything: emotion, affection, rebellion, illness, until it consumed him from within. His body was embalmed immediately. The rot was too advanced. They removed his heart and sealed it in a golden reliquary. His corpse was placed in a coffin of cedar and silver, then carried, without public spectacle, to the crypt beneath El Escorial. There, in a granite vault beside his wives, his children, his failed heirs, and phantom hopes, the king was laid to rest. No eulogy, no music, only the sound of stone sliding into place. Spain had lost its monarch, but it had long since begun to lose its empire. With Philip's death, a slow unraveling accelerated. His son, Philip III, took the throne, a boy molded not by steel or strategy, but by the shadow of a father who had spoken more with silence than with teaching. Philip III had neither the will to rule nor the instinct to lead. He deferred to favorites. He ruled by proxy. He signed what was placed before him. He nodded more than he commanded. The empire still looked immense on maps. The sun still technically never set, but its edges had already begun to wither. The Netherlands slipped further from control. Portugal, forced into union by Philip II, grew increasingly resentful, its nobles restless, its colonies stretched thin. The Spanish economy, bloated by silver, strangled by debt, and warped by inflation, began to collapse under its own weight. The Inquisition, once the iron hand of unity, had become a theater of terror, feared, mocked, and resented in equal measure. And still, the crown insisted all was well. Still, the image of Philip, black-robed, unwavering, pious, was held up as ideal. Even as the roots of rot spread beneath the marble floors of palaces and cathedrals. The Habsburg dynasty endured, but it endured as something hollow. The bloodline remained intact, but it was no longer strong. Marriages continued, uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, each generation more brittle than the last. They believed they were preserving purity. In truth, they were sowing deformity, sterility, and decline. And the world began to notice. Foreign courts mocked the Habsburg chin, the drooping lip, the glassy eyes. Doctors whispered of inherited madness. Diplomats predicted extinction, and they were not wrong. By the end of the 17th century, the Spanish Habsburgs had nearly extinguished themselves. Children were born with fused vertebrae. Princes could not chew solid food. Mental disorders were treated with prayer and leeches, neither of which delayed the inevitable. When Charles II, the great-grandson of Philip II, was born, he was already broken. He could not walk until age 4. He could not speak clearly. He suffered seizures, hallucinations, and infertility. He was called El Hechizado, the bewitched one. He would be the last of his line, a living tomb for the sins of dynastic pride. But that was still decades away. In 1598, when Philip II died, most of Spain still believed in the myth of divine monarchy, of holy blood, of empire without end. But myths, like bodies, decay. And Philip's legacy was already shifting, from greatness to gravity, from triumph to tragedy. He had ruled longer than any king of Spain. He had expanded the empire more than any before him. He had built El Escorial, waged holy wars, and stamped his name onto continents. But what he left behind was not unity, not strength, not peace. He left a son unprepared, a court afraid to speak, a faith weaponized into bureaucracy, a nation drowning in the rituals of yesterday. And above all, he left a lineage slowly folding into itself like parchment scorched at the edges, curling inward toward ash. He had tried to control everything, his family, his kingdom, his own decay. But power cannot defeat time, and blood, however noble, cannot escape its consequences. He ruled a world drawn in gold. But inside the palace, everything faded to gray. Philip II of Spain is remembered in maps and marble, his name etched across continents, his reign stretching from the Andes to Antwerp, from Manila to Madrid. They called him El Prudente, the prudent king, a man of caution, calculation, and faith so absolute it drowned every doubt. But behind the titles, behind the empire, behind the legends, was a man surrounded by coffins. He married 4 times. 3 of those wives were close relatives. 1 was his niece. 1 was his cousin. 1 was a cousin aunt. All died before him. He had children, many, but most of them never learned to speak, to walk, to grow old. Ferdinand died as a baby. Carlos Lorenzo died at 7. Diego at 7. Don Carlos, his firstborn, died locked in a cell, possibly by his father's own orders. Only Philip III survived. And even then, what survived was not strength, but submission. The family tree was a spiral. Each generation folded back into itself. Uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, grandfather to granddaughter. The goal was preservation. But what they preserved was not greatness, it was entropy. They thought they were protecting legacy, but they were breeding its collapse. Each child born from those unions carried the weight of too many shadows, too much sameness, too little oxygen in the bloodline. It wasn't just deformity of body, it was deformity of spirit. Philip's marriages were not unions, they were rituals. They were sacrifices, ceremonies carved into the bone of empire, where the altar was always the womb and the cost was always a coffin. He loved order. He built his world in straight lines and sacred numbers. El Escorial, his palace mausoleum, was a geometry of grief. Granite laid with precision, walls stripped of beauty, silence curated like incense. It was not a home. It was a kingdom of shadows, where footsteps vanished before they echoed, and where the dead outnumbered the living. Philip did not laugh. He did not smile. He did not teach his son to dance, to sing, to hope. He taught him how to kneel, how to obey, how to suffer, because that's what the crown had become. A weight passed hand to hand, father to son, without warmth or wisdom, just expectation and prayer. In the end, the empire outlived him, but only just. Its flesh remained, but the spirit began to seep away. Rebellions flared, debt swallowed the treasury. The Inquisition burned more books than it saved souls. And across the courts of Europe, whispers began to rise. they're still marrying their own. Their heirs are weak. Their minds are breaking. It didn't happen all at once. Decline rarely does. But the seeds were planted in Philip's time, in every cousin marriage, in every child who coughed and died, in every silence that replaced love. He believed he was building God's empire, but what he built was a dynasty of ghosts. And what remains now? A name etched in tombs, a cold palace visited by tourists, a few oil paintings of a man in black, lips tight, eyes empty, and a cautionary tale whispered through centuries, that even the greatest ruler cannot command blood, that even the most pious crown cannot bless a curse written in flesh, that every cradle built in the name of power can become a coffin. I have walked the halls of El Escorial, not in person, but in pages, in ruins, in echoes. I have seen what happens when an empire chooses blood over love, silence over truth, duty over tenderness. And I wonder, what if Philip had married someone outside the web? What if he had embraced joy instead of guilt? What if, just once, he had reached for affection instead of ritual? Would Spain have survived longer? Would his sons have lived? Would he have smiled before death? We cannot rewrite history, but we can remember it. Not as a triumph of conquest, not as a golden age of cathedrals and colonies, but as a warning. That legacy without love is a mausoleum. And that sometimes the greatest tragedy is not how a king dies, but how he teaches his children to live.